The Waste Land is a modernist work of literature. Modernism is a movement that rose out of the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a response to the disenfranchisement caused by factors such as the Industrial Revolution and World War I. World War I was especially difficult for European society because much of the war was being fought on or very near to their home turf. The society felt fragmented and panicked. Countries lost an entire generation of men to the war. T.S. Eliot, the author of The Waste Land, lived in England at the time of the war, experienced the terrors of the war firsthand, and commented on it in The Waste Land. The allusions and imagery in The Waste Land are essential in understanding the significance of the poem and what the poem meant to the general population as a commentary on the effects of World War I. Through the allusions to the Satyricon and the Fisher King, and the imagery of the tree, the perfume, and the trenches, Eliot reflects the hopelessness, the uselessness, and the sterility that seemed to characterize European society after World War I. The epigraph that Eliot chose for The Waste Land is from the Satyricon. It reads, "For indeed I myself have seen with my own eyes the Sibyl at Cumae, hanging in a bottle. And when those boys would say to her, 'Sibyl, what do you want?' she would reply, 'I want to die.'" This quote from the Satyricon has a story behind it. The Sibyl is a prophetess who writes prophecies on leaves. She made a deal with Apollo that he would grant her eternal life. However, she did not ask for eternal youth, and therefore shrinks into a tiny cricket and becomes entirely useless. She spends the rest of her eternity wishing for death, because she no longer has any use. Eliot uses this choice of epigraph to set the tone for the poem. Eliot's allusion to the Sibyl's uselessness parallels the sense of uselessness that pervaded European society after World War I. The most important allusion in The Waste Land is that of the Fisher King. The poem even takes its title from this story. The story of the Fisher King is part of the story of the search for the Holy Grail. In the story of the Fisher King, Percival is searching for his mother. During the search, Percival comes across a body of water too large for him to cross. In the water is a man in a boat. Percival asks the man if there's a bridge by which he could reach the other side of the body of water. When the man in the boat says there is not, Percival asks if he knows of a place where he could spend the night. The man in the boat tells him that he lives in a house up on the cliff, and that Percival is welcome to spend the night. When Percival arrives at the castle, he comes across a handsome yet injured nobleman. The nobleman, who is the Fisher King and also the man in the boat that Percival saw previously, bestows gifts upon Percival. Throughout the night, as Percival and the Fisher King chat and dine, squires enter carrying strange objects. First, a squire walks through the room holding a pure white lance that is dripping blood. Secondly, two squires come into the room holding candelabras. Finally, a maiden enters the room holding a grail that shines so brightly it makes everything else in the room seem as if it has gone dim. This is the Holy Grail. Percival, for fear of sounding stupid, does not ask about any of these objects. However, his failure to ask the right questions is his downfall. The Fisher King needed Percival to ask about these objects. The Fisher King had been wounded in battle, with an implication that the wound affected his fertility. Because the king is wounded and therefore barren, so is his kingdom. In other words, his kingdom is a wasteland. The Fisher King can only be restored to full health by a hero who asks the right questions. Unfortunately, Percival fails this test. The symbol of the Fisher King is one of barrenness, both of ruler and of land. Similarly, Europe after World War I felt barren and empty. It was also literally barren because Europe had lost a whole generation of young men who had been nearing the age of parenthood. There is also a link between the allusions to the Sibyl and the Fisher King. Like Percival fails to ask the right questions, the Sibyl asks for eternal life without eternal youth. Her failure to ask the right questions leads to her uselessness. Aside from Eliot's allusions, such as those to the Sibyl and the Fisher King, Eliot also uses imagery that parallels European society after World War I. One image that Eliot uses is that of a tree. Eliot says, "What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water." The tree described is decrepit, dead, not in fertile soil, and does not provide a safe refuge or shelter. This description also fits what Europe felt like during and after World War I. Even Europeans' own homes did not feel like a safe shelter because the war was being fought very close to them. Also, the mention of the cricket in the quote brings to mind the Sibyl, who is unfulfilled and cannot die. Finally, the mention of the water is very important. Water is a source of life both for the tree and for people, but there is no sound of water. If there is no water, there is death and decay. Wastelands lack water. Another image that Eliot uses is that of a corpse being planted in a garden and then sprouting in the spring. In the poem, Eliot writes, "That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year?" Eliot uses this image to show the pain of memory and desire. Many people lost loved ones during World War I, and oftentimes their memories cause them pain and longing for the past. The image of the corpse being buried but still sprouting parallels memories and longings still popping up even after the body of their loved ones are buried. Eliot also uses the image of synthetic perfume in The Wasteland. Interestingly enough, the first synthetic perfume, Chanel No. 5, was released the same year as The Wasteland. Synthetic perfume does not have a natural smell, but does smell wonderful. If a person wears too much, however, perfume can be overwhelming and can obstruct the senses. Eliot uses perfume to point out that being in the modern world is like having too much perfume on. It can trouble, confuse, and overwhelm you and your senses. The most important, and the most chilling, image in the poem, however, is that of the trenches. Eliot invokes the image of the trenches when he writes, "I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones." World War I is known for its trench warfare. The practice of using trenches was futile and bloody. Soldiers would wait for days or weeks in the trenches and would suddenly be thrown into battle when their enemies began to attack. Both sides would wait in trenches, and when one side's superiors gave them the order, the soldiers were to jump out of the front of the trenches and run towards their enemies' trenches. The soldiers' enemies would be protected in their trenches, while the soldiers were running into open fire with no protection. Their deaths were nearly certain. However, their superiors believed that if they had enough willpower and morale, they would be able to overpower their enemies. Tactically, this was not possible, but the superiors did not understand that. Trench warfare was responsible for much of the blood spilt in World War I. I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. Eliot refers to the trenches as Rat's Alley because they were very dirty, oftentimes filled with water, and sometimes infested with vermin. The soldiers were forced to live in these conditions, to die in these conditions. trench warfare was bloody and contributed substantially to the deaths in World War I. All of the allusions and imagery that Eliot uses in The Waste Land shows decay, anxiety, death, uselessness, sterility, and other characteristics of a wasteland. Eliot's allusions to the Sibyl from the Satyricon and the Fisher King reflect uselessness and sterility. The image of the tree reflects the loss of a safe haven for those in Europe. The image of the corpse reminds us of painful memories. The perfume illustrates the panic and confusion in society at the time, and the image of the trenches is one of futility and bloodiness. Eliot wrote The Waste Land as a commentary on European society following World War I. The society was in a state of panic, as it had experienced many horrors very close to home. It is impossible to appreciate Eliot's writing and commentary on his society without understanding his allusions and imagery. Most of the allusions and images are of sterility and decay, two main characteristics of a wasteland. Eliot wrote The Waste Land also as a warning of the dangers of war. However, his warnings, and others, were not heeded, as World War II sprung up around 20 years later.